Hi guys, good morning. If you remember correctly, we read part of chapter 15, Goodbye Georgina. So we're going to finish chapter 15 today, okay? And the last part is, I can't believe it, Grandpa Joe was yelling. They're getting younger and younger, they really are. Just look at Grandpa George's hair. And his teeth, cried Charlie. Hey, Grandpa, you're getting lovely white teeth all over again. Mother, shouted Mrs. Bucket to Grandma Georgina. Oh, Mother, you're beautiful. You're so young. And just look at Dad, she went on, pointing at Grandpa George. Isn't he handsome? What's it feel like, Josie? Asked Grandpa Joe excitedly. Tell us what it feels like to be back to 30 again. Wait a minute. You look younger than 30. You can't be a day more than 20. But that isn't it. I should stop there if I were you. 20's quite young enough. Mr. Wonka shook his head sadly, passed a hand over his eyes. He had been standing very close to him. You would have heard him murmuring softly under his breath, Oh, dearie, dearie, dearie me, here we go again. Mother, cried Mrs. Bucket. And now there was a shrill note of alarm in her voice. Why don't you stop, Mother? You're going too far. You're way under 20. You can't be more than 15. You're 10. You're getting smaller. Mother! Josie, shouted Grandpa Joe. Hey, Josie, don't do it. Josie, you're shrinking. You're a little girl. Stop her. Somebody quick. They're all going too far, cried Charlie. They took too much, said Mr. Bucket. Mother's shrinking faster than any of them, wailed Mrs. Bucket. Mother, can't you hear me? Mother, can't you stop? My heavens, isn't it quick, said Mr. Bucket, who seemed to be the only one enjoying it. It really is a year a second. But they've hardly got any more years left, wailed Grandpa Joe. Mother's no more than 4 now, Mrs. Bucket cried out. She's 3, she's 2, she's 1. Gracious me, what's happening to her? Where has she gone? Mother, Georgina, where are you? Mr. Wonka, come quickly, come here, Mr. Wonka. Something frightful has happened. Something's wrong. My mother's disappeared. Mr. Wonka sighed, turned around, and walked slowly and quite calmly back towards the bed. Where's my mother? Bawled Mrs. Bucket. Look at Josephine, cried Grandpa Joe. Just look at her, I ask you. Mr. Wonka looked first at Grandma Josephine. She was sitting in the middle of the huge bed, bawling her head off. Wah, 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 she said. Wah, wah, wah. She's a screaming baby, cried Grandpa Joe. I've got a screaming baby for a wife. The other one's Grandpa George, Mr. Bucket said, smiling happily. The slightly bigger one there crawling around, he's my wife's father. That's right, he's my father, wailed Mrs. Bucket. And where's Georgina, my old mother? She's vanished. She's nowhere. Mr. Wonka, she's absolutely nowhere. I saw her getting smaller and smaller, and in the end, she just got so small she disappeared into thin air. What I want to know is where she's gone to, and how in the world are we going to get her back? Ladies and gentlemen, said Mr. Wonka, coming up close and raising both hands for silence. Please, I beg you, do not ruffle yourselves. There's nothing to worry about. Look, the old people, they're babies now. And Grandma Georgina is gone. You call it nothing, cried poor Mrs. Bucket, when my old mother's gone down the drain and my father's a howling baby. A lovely baby, said Mr. Wonka. I quite agree, said Mr. Bucket. What about my Josie? Cried Grandpa Joe. What about her? Said Mr. Wonka. Well, a great improvement, sir, said Mr. Wonka. Don't you agree? Oh, yes, said Grandpa Joe. I mean, no, what am I saying? She's a howling baby. But in perfect health, said Mr. Wonka. May I ask you, sir, how many pills she took? 4, said Grandpa Joe glumly. They all took 4. Mr. Wonka made a wheezing noise in his throat. A look of great sorrow came over his face. Oh, why can't people be more sensible, he said sadly. Why don't they listen to me when I tell them something? I explained very carefully beforehand that each pill makes the taker exactly 20 years younger. So if Grandma Josephine took 4 of them, she automatically became younger by 4 times 20, which is, wait a minute now, 4 2's 8, add a naught, that's 80. So she automatically became younger by 80 years. How old was your wife, sir? If I may ask, before this happened, she was 80 last birthday, Grandpa Joe answered. She was 80 in 3 months. There you are then, cried Mr. Wonka, flashing a happy smile. The Wonkavite worked perfectly. She is now precisely 3 months old, and a plumper, rosier infant I've never set eyes on. Nor me, said Mr. Bucket. She'd win a prize in any baby competition. First prize, said Mr. Wonka. Cheer up, Grandpa, said Charlie, taking the old man's hand in his. Don't be sad. She's a beautiful baby. Madam, said Mr. Wonka, turning to Mrs. Bucket, how old, may I ask, was Grandpa George, your father? 81, wailed Mrs. Bucket. He was 81 exactly, which makes him the great bouncing one-year-old boy now, said Mr. Wonka happily. How splendid, said Mr. Bucket to his wife. You'll be the first person in the world to change your father's nappies. He can change his own rotten nappies, said Mrs. Bucket. What I want to know is, where's my mother? Where's Grandma Georgina? Aha, said Mr. Wonka. Aha, yes indeed. Oh, where has Georgina gone? How old, please, was the lady in question? 78, Mrs. Bucket told him. Well, of course, laughed Mr. Wonka. That explains it. What explains what? Snapped Mrs. Bucket. My dear madam, said Mr. Wonka, if she was only 78 and she took enough Wonkavite to make her 80 years younger, then naturally she's vanished. She's bitten off more than she could chew. She's taken off more years than she had. Explain yourself, said Mrs. Bucket. Simple arithmetic, said Mr. Wonka. Subtract 80 from 79 and what do you get? -2. Hooray, said Mrs. Bucket. Mr. Bucket, my mother-in-law is -2 years old. Impossible, said Mrs. Bucket. It's true, said Mr. Wonka. And where is she now, may I ask? Said Mrs. Bucket. That's a good question, said Mr. Wonka. A very good question, yes indeed. Where is she now? You don't have the foggiest idea, do you? Of course I do, said Mr. Wonka. I know exactly where she is. Then tell me. You must try to understand, said Mr. Wonka, that if she is now -2, she's got to add 2 more years before she can start again from naught. She's got to wait it out. Where does she wait, said Mrs. Bucket. In the waiting room, of course, said Mr. Wonka. Boom, boom. The drums of the Oompa Loompas band. Boom, 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 boom. And all the Oompa Loompas, all the hundreds of them standing there in the chocolate room, began to sway and hop and dance to the rhythm of the music. Attention, please, they sang. Attention, please, don't dare to talk. Don't dare to sneeze, don't daze or daydream. Stay awake, your health, your very life's at stake. Ho, ho, you say, they can't mean me. Ha, ha, we answer, wait and see. Did any of you ever meet a child called Goldie Pinklesweet, who, on her 7th birthday, went to stay with Granny down in Kent? At lunchtime, on the 2nd day of dearest little Goldie's stay, Granny announced, I'm going down to do some shopping in town. Do you know why Granny didn't tell the child to come along as well? She's going to the nearest inn to buy herself a double gin. So out she creeps, she shuts the door, and Goldie, after making sure that she is really by herself, goes quickly in the medicine shelf. And there her little greedy eyes sees pills of every shape and size. Such fascinating colors, too. Some green, some pink, some brown, some blue. All right, she says, let's try the brown. She takes one pill and gulps it down. Yum, yum, she cries. Hooray, what fun. They're chocolate-coated, every one. She gobbles 5, she gobbles 10, she gobbles her, gobbling only, when the last pill's gone. There are no more. Slowly she rises from the floor. She stops, she hiccups. Dear, oh dear, she starts to feel a trifle queer. You see, how could young Goldie know, for nobody had told her so, that Grandmama, her old relation, suffered from frightful constipation. This meant that every night she'd give herself a powerful laxative. And all the medicines that she'd bought were naturally of this sort. The pink and red and blue and green were all extremely strong and mean. But far more fierce and meaner still was Granny's little chocolate pill. Its blast effect was quite uncanny. It used to shake up even Granny. In point of fact, she did not dare to use them more than twice a year. So can you wonder, little Goldie began to feel a wee bit moldy. Inside her tummy, something stirred. A funny gurgling sound was heard. And then, oh dear, from deep within, the ghastly rumbling sounds began. They rumbilate and roar and boom. They bounce and echo round the room. The floorboards shake and from the wall some bits of paint and plaster fall. Explosions, whistles, awful bangs were followed by the loudest clings. A man next door was heard to say, "A thunderstorm is on the way." But on and on the rumbling goes. A window cracks, a lamp ball blows. Young Goldie clutched herself and cried, "There's something wrong with my inside." This was we very greatly fear, the understatement of the year. For wouldn't any child feel crummy with loud explosions in her tummy? Granny at 2:30 came in, weaving a little from the gin, but even so she quickly saw the empty bottle on the floor. "My precious laxative," she cried. "I don't feel well," the girl replied. Angrily, Grandma shook her head. "I'm really not surprised," she said. "Why can't you leave my pills alone?" With that, she grabbed the telephone and shouted, "Listen, send us quick an ambulance. A child is sick. It's number 50 Fontwell Road. Come fast, I think she might explode." We're sure you do not wish to hear about the hospital and where they did a lot of horrid things. With stomach pumps and rubber rings, let's answer what you want to know. Did Goldie live or did she go? The doctors gathered round her bed. There's really not much hope, they said. "She's going, gone," they cried. "She's had her chip, she's dead. I'm not so sure," the child replied. And all at once she opened wide her great big bluish eyes and sighed, and gave the anxious docs a wink, and said, "I'll be okay, I think." So Goldie lived, and back she went, at first to Granny's place in Kent. Her father came the second day and fetched her in a Chevrolet, and drove her to their home in Dover. But Goldie's troubles were not over. You see, if someone takes enough of any highly dangerous stuff, one will invariably find some traces of it left behind. It pains us greatly to relate that Goldie suffered from this fate. She'd taken such a massive fill of this unpleasant kind of pill, it got into her blood and bones and messed up all her chromosomes. It made her constantly upset, and she could never really get the beastly stuff to go away. And so the girl was forced to stay for 7 hours every day within the everlasting gloom of what we call the ladies' room. After all, the WC, it is not the gayest place to be. So now, before it's too late, take heed of Goldie's dreadful fate, and seriously, all jokes apart, do promise us across your heart that you will never help yourself to medicine from the medicine shelf. That is the end of chapter 15. So that's what happened to Grandma Georgina. And tomorrow we will cover Vida Wonk and Minus Land. Okay? Whatever that is. Vida Wonk and Minus Land tomorrow. You guys stay safe, and don't forget, wash your hands. I'll see you in a bit.